Hello everyone, my name is Emma Wood and today I am excited to present to you some information about the unique behavioral adaptations of wildlife living in urban areas. One of the first things I would like to talk about today is why an animal would choose to move to the city in the first place. There are immediately quite a few cons that come to mind when you think of an animal moving to this space. First of all, there tends to be a lot less vegetation and tree cover for these animals than what they're used to. That tree cover and vegetation is typically heavily replaced with man-made barriers such as walkways, roads, buildings, bridges, unusual items that these animals have never seen before. There's also a high human population that cannot be ignored in the city environment, and typically there is a huge loss of native food sources for these animals. For example, a lot of them are used to consuming berries, seeds, other types of vegetation, and potentially other animals. And a lot of those resources are not available to these animals once they move into the urban space. With all of that in mind, there are actually quite a few pros that come with moving to the city. First of all, the area does tend to be a bit warmer because of the asphalt and concrete absorbing the sunlight and creating a bit of a warmer space for them. There also tends to be new forms of shelter if an animal can find a space. It tends to be less competed for. Same goes with novel food sources. If an animal can figure out how to eat some sort of new food, there tends to be less competition for it because that niche has yet to be filled in that urban space. The idea of these animals choosing to live in this space and needing to learn new skills in order to successfully live in these spaces has led me to my thesis for this presentation, which is that living in an urban area has led to unique behavioral adaptations in most wildlife. Before an animal can truly start adapting to an environment, however, they first need to establish themselves in it. And there are specific types of animals that are a bit more successful in doing this than others. Animals that tend to be a bit better at adapting to new environments are generalist species. A generalist species is a type of animal that typically is capable of eating wider ranges of food. As you can see, for example, this raccoon here, it could eat anything from the eggs and seeds and berries that it is used to eating in the woods, or it can eat peanut butter toast, or even potentially a piece of meat that it finds in the trash can. Another example is for a generalist is that they can make shelter in diverse environments. As you can see in the second picture on this screen, the bird here has obviously been able to nest on what looks like a windowsill, which is definitely not a natural space for a bird to nest in, but they have been able to adapt and create offspring in that odd environment. And the last, but one of the most important strategies that a generalist can utilize is that they have a very wide range of behavioral responses that they can use to respond to different stimuli or adapt to a new environment. The concept that comes into play here is something called behavioral plasticity. Behavioral plasticity is in animals' ability to respond to something with a wider range of behaviors. So they can change their behavior in order to best respond to a stimuli. There are two levels of behavioral plasticity. The first is the expression of a previously known behavior. So this could be a behavior that they know and that they can practice, but they might not be actively practicing in that moment. And they can shift to practicing that behavior if their new environment requires it in order for them to survive. The second level of behavioral plasticity is the development of new behaviors. This is commonly seen with learning and problem solving. A great example of an organism displaying both levels of behavioral plasticity is with the kea. The kea is a parrot-like bird that resides in New Zealand, and these guys have a pre-existing behavior called neophilia, which is an interest in novel objects. These birds are naturally curious and they can turn on that curiosity, or I guess for them it might be a more naturally constantly existing behavior that when they see something new, they will explore it. Over time, this new behavior in an urban environment has led them to developing a new skill, which is opening car doors. While this does make them quite a nuisance for the humans living in these urban spaces with the Kia, it does give the Kia access to a resource that other animals are not typically able to get to, which gives them that survivalist's edge. Though animals like the Kia may have an advantage in getting themselves to an urban space, there's still a lot for these animals to learn when it comes to truly establishing themselves in that area and adapting to it. One of the first challenges that these animals encounter is navigating this new space. Yes, they may have found themselves in that space, but if they cannot find their way around it, then they will severely lose a lot of access to some great resources, and it will make it much more difficult for them to survive. Some common challenges for navigating an urban space is again that fragmented vegetation and tree cover. They have a lot less that they can hide under. There are also a lot of man-made barriers that break up the spaces that these animals would like to go to find resources, not to mention a very large human population that they have to learn to avoid. On top of all of that, the resources are few and far between. So they have to navigate the area and be able to find those resources in order to survive. There are some adaptational trends that these animals have developed in order to navigate the area. A very common trend is that they will change the periods of the day in which they're active. A lot of animals will choose to move around during times where humans are less active. So that may be at dawn or dusk. It may be during the night. Animals that you may typically see during the day in a rural space will be active more during those dawn or dusk area times of the day or in the night. Another unique trend that you will see is a unique population distribution. Some species of animal that would tend to stay apart from other members of their species may be grouped together just because they all need to access resources that are grouped much more closely. Example of an animal that has learned how to navigate the urban space is the coyote. The coyote is a generalist species that is unique in that it is considered at times to be an apex predator and a very large carnivore. Those types of animals are very rare to see in an urban space, but these coyotes have chosen to infiltrate this space and gain some of the resources that are available to them. Two studies have been conducted to look into how these coyotes have adjusted in order to utilize this space. One was done in Denver, Colorado, and the other was done in Chicago, Illinois. In both studies, coyotes were identified living in rural, suburban, or urban areas. Researchers then monitored and recorded these coyotes' behaviors and their movements. This included defining what each coyote's home range was and the time that they spent in different areas of their home range. Specifically with the Chicago study, they also compared the time that the coyote spent foraging, so staying in one area and not staying in one area, traveling about their home range and finding food versus encamped, so staying in one space, typically their shelter space, sleeping, spending time with their conspecifics, and avoiding animals outside of their own species. In both studies, the result was that urban coyotes had larger home ranges than rural coyotes. As you can see in this example from Chicago, this right here is the urban space, this is the suburban space, and then this is the urban space. Sorry, did I say urban here? This is the rural space. As you can see, it does look broken up and makes it look a little bit smaller, but the urban home range for these coyotes is actually quite a bit larger than this rural space here. The same is also true for the Denver study. The Denver study did uniquely identify, though, that coyotes in that space were less active during the day compared to the rural coyotes living just outside of Denver. The urban coyotes tended to come out mainly at night, whereas the rural coyotes could also be seen during the day. The Chicago study uniquely identified that coyotes in rural areas did spend less time traveling and more time foraging, even though their home ranges were larger. So this shows how the coyotes did have to set up a larger range at first in order to get enough resources to survive. But once they defined their home range and found the areas that resources were plentiful, they spent more time in those areas compared to the rural coyotes who had to continuously travel their entire home range in order to find enough resources. Another awesome example of an animal that has learned to navigate around humans and urban spaces is with the Eurasian red squirrel. There were two studies done on this red squirrel by the same group of researchers. Both studies occurred in Hokkaido, Japan. In the first study, researchers compared the flight distance of rural versus urban squirrels when exposed to different objects. So the flight distance is how close the object could get before the squirrels ran away, usually ran away up a tree. The objects included in this study involved a novel object, so something that the rural or urban squirrels had never seen before. They also utilized taxidermized predators, as you can see here in this image. And lastly, they utilized humans. In the second study, the researchers focused in more on human and squirrel interactions. Once again, they compared the reaction of urban and rural squirrels to humans. This time they measured how, once the squirrel was triggered to run away, how far away it ran up the tree, and also what behaviors the squirrel showed once they stopped running away. The results of the study did show, specifically with the first one, that rural and urban squirrels did respond equally to novel objects, but urban squirrels were slower to run away from predators and humans compared to the rural squirrels. This shows, for one, that the urban squirrels were probably more acclimatized to humans, less afraid of them, and more likely to be a bit slower to run away. And it also may have shown that the urban squirrels had seen less predators and were therefore less afraid of them, less likely to run away because they didn't understand that what they were seeing was a threat. The second study found that urban squirrels would stop running at a much shorter distance than the rural squirrels. So once triggered to run, the urban squirrels would run a much shorter distance up the tree and then stop and start showing their behavior with the human. The urban squirrels actually showed a very unique behavior called mobbing, where this is actually an aggressive display from squirrels. It's supposed to intimidate. So what would happen is these urban squirrels would run up the tree a short distance, turn around, and start attempting to intimidate the human that was approaching them, rather than with the rural squirrels, they would typically just run away and hide. Another huge challenge for these animals in an urban environment is finding food. Obviously, a lot of the natural things that are typically available to these animals are now gone in an urban space. They have lost a lot of their original food options, and the food that is available is much more difficult to access because humans are very good and actively try to hide food away from animals. Some adaptational trends do include these animals learning how to eat man-made food. They have learned to recognize it and know that it is healthy and safe for them to eat. There is also an increased neophilia, so an increased interest in exploring new objects. And there tends to be populations grouped around accessible resources because those resources are harder to find. So once there is a resource, all the animals group together to take advantage of it. A great example of this ability to learn new ways to find food comes from the herring gull. The herring gull's natural diet typically involves fish and other marine organisms, insects, eggs, and occasionally other birds. When they're in the city, however, a herring gull will eat pretty much anything that they can get their mouth on. And a recent study did show that these gulls may show a preference for items that have been handled by humans. This result came from a study that started by setting out two identically wrapped pancakes. If I remember correctly, these pancakes were wrapped in blue paper, and one had been handled by a human, one had not. In the second version of the study, they set out two identically wrapped non-food items, one handled by a human and one not, and they again looked similar to the blue wrapped pancake. I think they were like blue sponges or something like that. In both experiments, they measured how many gulls pecked at the objects and which one they pecked at the most. The results of the study showed two different things. First of all, regarding the food items, The results showed that 79% of gulls involved in the study approached the item that had been handled, the food item that had been handled, over the food item that had not been handled. Regarding the non-food items, the gulls actually showed no preference, and they pecked at items less overall. So what that means is that the gulls probably did have some innate ability to recognize that an item was a food item and something that they could eat, but they have shown that they have learned that humans tend to handle the items that are maybe a bit yummier, a bit more nutritionally heavy for them, and so they have preferentially shown to choose items that have been handled by humans because they are typically a better food source for the birds altogether. Another big challenge for animals living in an urban space is mating and reproduction. The biggest challenge with mating and reproduction for animals in an urban space is their ability to locate a mate. I know I mentioned earlier that populations of species tend to be grouped together because of resources, but for the same reason that there is a lack of resources, there can also be a more distributed population than normal because the resources are so scarce that in specific areas there may not be enough of one resource for the animals to stick around in a group. So that means that it can be a little bit harder to find a mate because they can't locate one. On top of that, the different noise and items involved in a city environment can make it very hard for an animal to practice their normal mating rituals. So some general adaptational trends that come with this is that firstly, the animal will change their mating ritual. A very common example of this is vocalization in birds, which there is an amazing study that was on the urban great tit to show how they have changed their vocalizations in order to still attract a mate despite urban environments. So with this study, researchers measured the acoustic characteristics of 32 male great tits. They then measured the acoustics of the city. Overall, they found that the great tits can sing at frequencies ranging from 2.82 to 3.77 kilohertz, and that the typical urban noise ranges on the lower end of that spectrum. After studying, they did find that birds living in quieter areas tended to sing at their lower frequency level, while birds living in noisier areas would sing at the higher frequencies. So this shows that these animals have had to learn a special adaptation of singing at a higher range in order for their voice to travel above the urban noise and allow them to attract a mate. Through this study, I hope that you can see that for wildlife, surviving in an urban area is pretty tricky. There is a lot less tree cover and vegetation for them. They have to deal with a high human population and a lot of man-made barriers that are brand new to these animals. And there's also a loss of native food sources. Despite these animals have developed very unique behavioral adaptations so that they can survive and thrive, such as being able and willing to explore new things and problem solve, being able to change the way that they navigate a space or even the time of day that they're active. These animals have also learned how to take advantage of new and unusual food sources, and they've gone so far as to develop new mating rituals to locate mates and reproduce. Here are my references. I do hope that you enjoyed this short presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.